Break, everyone. Hopefully by now you've all had a chance to see the Li Hongwei exhibit downstairs in the Joy Light Gallery. And one of the things that makes his work so remarkable is his use of crystalline glazes. And these are glazes that really have a special property so that they create these intricate crystalline patterns in the firing process, and it gives them a very unique look. Beautiful as they are really rather difficult to work with because they're unpredictable in many cases. At times, a single piece can be come out beautifully on one side and just nothing on the other. So it takes obviously lots of experience and understanding to work with these glazes. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Robert Morris. Bob's a local ceramic artist who, over the past 15 years, has been working with crystalline glazes. And I just want to add, if you want to see some wonderful examples of his work, they're in the gift shop. So take a look after. Bob comes from a scientific background. He spent 30 years in the pharmaceutical business, starting here locally back when it was Upjohn and ending when it was Pfizer. So after that, retiring, he began really kind of a second act, and that is in ceramics, which he picked up, just gave a try down here at the KIA, and really fell in love with the whole process, and this really kind of leads us where we are today. So we have an opportunity to not only see Bob's work, but also really learn more firsthand experience about what it's like to work with these glazes that produce such a striking result. So at this point, please welcome Bob Morris.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. I want to thank Jessica Sundstrom for contacting me and the KIA for giving me this opportunity to talk about my work. Life can be very unpredictable. We really don't know how our lives are going to unfold. If someone had told me 20 years ago that I would be standing here in the KIA, in this space, talking about my artwork, I would have said, "You're nuts." I probably would have said, "You're expletive nuts." But amazingly, I've been working as a potter for 15 years. So I'm very grateful for this second act. Following my retirement, after my experience in the pharmaceutical industry, I kicked around doing a little bit of this, a little bit of that. What I found was I have to have some place to go with something to do when I get there. So ultimately, I found myself in a ceramics class at KVCC. It's kind of a long and involved story on how I got there, so we won't go into that now. There's not enough time. But at that time, KVCC had a fairly extensive ceramics program run by Francis Granzato. They had a lot of course offerings, and I wound up taking every course they had and then going back and taking them again. I was introduced out there to a whole new world for me. I found it fascinating and fulfilling. And I have to thank KVCC and especially Francis for making my second act possible. Right now I've got a studio in the Park Trade Center. I've been there for about 12 years, I think. So during that time at KVCC, I was introduced to the crystalline glazes, and after some failures, I began to get some reasonable results. I like the technical aspects of working with the glazes, the crystalline glazes, and I really like the results when they work. The crystals can be iridescent and appear to float in the glaze, giving the glaze a sense of depth. The glazes can change with the lighting. The appearance of the glazes change with the lighting. I find this attractive and a bit unusual. Not too many potters work with it. There's no way to predict where and how the crystals will grow. So every time I open the kiln, I'm filled with anticipation. Sometimes disappointment, but that kind of goes with the territory with these glazes. As Greg said, downstairs, there's a wonderful exhibit by Li Hongwei. He uses the crystalline glazes combined with metalwork in stainless steel. His work is absolutely amazing. If you haven't seen that exhibit, it's well worth the trip downstairs. Excuse me. There's a video in that exhibit that shows a lot about his process, but it doesn't show much about the crystalline glaze. So Jessica asked if I could come and run through the process that I use. So what I'd like to do here today is talk a bit about this type of glaze, show you how I work through the glazing process, and then discuss some of my works. The typical crystalline glaze has a saturation of zinc oxide. The glaze gives a very fluid melt in the kiln, and some will actually flow off the surface of the piece. That really is the central issue in working with these glazes. They run down the sides of the pot. That has to happen to allow the crystals to seed and grow, especially if you want to see them grow in an isolated way. So much of the process is how to deal with those runny glazes. This title piece was fired flat in the kiln. There's a raised border around it, and this raised border has what I would call a standard glaze. A standard glaze in my mind is a glaze that stays where you put it at temperature in the kiln. And most potters are looking for something like that will reliably stay where they put it. And that's there in this case to make sure that the crystalline glaze doesn't run off the piece and stick to the kiln shelf. This piece has, this title piece has overlapping crystals as a result of it laying flat in the kiln, so the glaze is not moving that much. It's not really what I'm after, but it was one way to show the title of the talk. What I really want to see are individual crystals. This is a piece fired in the same firing as the previous one, and it's the same glaze base. You can see where the glaze has run into the cutouts along the edges, and that's a bit of a problem. That's something that I have to keep in mind whenever I'm doing cutouts or attaching handles or carvings, that type of thing. This is the other side of the pot without the distraction of the cutouts. And this to me is fairly pleasing. Maybe a fewer crystals. The surface of these glazes, the macrocrystalline glazes, is very shiny, and they're a little bit difficult to photograph. You can see some of the reflections of the side of the photo booth here. And I think I'm a better potter than I am a photographer, so some of these slides might leave a little bit to be desired. So anyway, this is kind of what I'm shooting for. The crystals are the stars of the piece. Crystalline glazes have a reputation for being pretty finicky. They're not very forgiving. And this piece shows what I started to get a couple of years ago, very dense overlapping crystals. This is another one showing the same thing. This is how I started the COVID pandemic period. You can see blistering down here. Not very pleasing. So the first thing that you'd normally consider, or I would normally consider, is my kiln elements are bad. But I had replaced the elements in the kiln only about 20 firings before I did this. Plus, I've got a programmable kiln, and the readouts were fine, indicating that I went through full firings. I didn't get any error messages. So I'm thinking it's not the elements. It's got to be something else. So I changed the thermocouples. I changed the control board. I started chasing different materials, changing materials, different suppliers, and so forth, all with the same results. And what I eventually found was that the kiln was going to temperature, but at the highest temperature, there was a wide range of, the kiln goes up, and normally it would be plus or minus 2 or 3 degrees at the upper temperature. And I was getting, in these circumstances, plus or minus 6 or 7 degrees. And that gave me the issue. So, oh, silly me, it was in fact the elements. So I spent a very long time chasing my tail and not getting a whole lot done. But in a way, it was kind of a good problem, because I had been using this same glazed base for years, and it sent me off looking for other glazed bases. So it's opened up a little bit of a new realm for me. This glaze has nickel in it. I've done this glaze successfully before, but it wasn't working here. You can see the crystals don't have the iridescence. The surface of the piece is not uniform and shiny. I have gotten that before, but not here. And what I think I've found, this is another problem with crystalline glazes, the zinc oxide has to be calcined for this glaze just before it's used, apparently. I did that just recently. I don't have a picture of it, but I did it just recently. Calcining zinc is heating it to 1800 degrees. You're driving off chemically bound water. And when I did that recently, I got a very good uniform appearance of the glaze. So some of the materials, there's another glaze that I have used where another component of that glaze has to be calcined just before it's used. Another issue with the crystalline glazes. Here, what I was trying to do here with this piece, I thought the crystals might be too thick, too dense. Actually, they turned out to be a pretty good distribution, but my fear was that they would be overlapping and they would obscure the carvings down here. So I intentionally tried to spray this thinly, and it's too thin, didn't work. So that goes in the box labeled targets. So those are free. This guy here has these little white pimples all over it. I've got absolutely no idea what happened there. None whatsoever. Okay, so I mentioned that I've gone off looking at some other glazes. This is a different glaze base. This glaze, these two pieces were fired on different schedules. And there is a difference, obviously. I mean, this guy over here has some copper in it along with the cobalt. This is just cobalt. So it's the same glaze base fired on different schedules, and you see a different halo appearance around the central crystal. It's almost like you've got little lobes around this guy, and it's much more uniform over here. There's a close-up to see that, to better see that appearance around the edge. So let's run through the process. This is a piece that's been thrown. The leaves attached to the side, the piece was dried, and then it was bisque fired, making it easier to handle. That's pretty standard stuff up to this point. Because of the fluidity of the glaze, each piece has to sit on a pedestal. This guy right here. And the whole assembly has to sit on a waste plate or a catch basin, because, like we've been saying, that glaze is going to run off the piece in the kiln. The pedestal has to fit the base exactly, and the surfaces need to be smooth so that they join well. I make the pedestals and waste plates separately. I pull up a cylinder and just cut it off at about 3/4 of an inch after it's gotten leather hard. So I make a whole bunch of those things at the same time. These are then bisque fired, and the bisque fired pieces are sanded so it's smooth. I use a belt sander to sand the pedestal pieces, and I sand the base of the piece itself. This is all done in an exhaust hood. Glue has to be made up to stick the pedestal on the base of the piece. And that glue is comprised, it's pretty simple stuff. It's a white glue plus clay. In this case, it's kaolin. And it's mixed up to a consistency that I can paint on the pedestal and on the base of the piece. Then the pedestal is glued to the piece, and I let it sit overnight. The next day, a liner glaze is applied. The piece again sits overnight. And then I weigh and mix the glaze and spray it on the piece. So this piece has been sprayed, and you can't tell, but there is a liner glaze that's been poured in and poured out. These glazes have to be made or should be made at the time of use. They don't store well. And if you leave them sit a while, you don't get such good crystals. Some of them will harden, excuse me, some of them will harden in the bottom of your container after a few days. It'll be like concrete. If you are going to try to store them, I've heard that you can't store them in plastic containers, and you really can't store them in metal containers. The best way to attempt to store them is in glass. And I'm not particularly diligent about cleaning the studio, and I've got little glass bottles of this stuff all over the place. So the glazes are mixed up. They're pushed through an 80 mesh screen. They're mixed with an immersion blender. When I first began doing this, I understood that the glazes needed to be on the pot, put on the pot very thickly, brushed on, and they could be as thick as 1/4 of an inch. I'd heard that people had done all kinds of things to try to keep the glaze up on the pot, even to the extent of attempting to do that by cracking an egg into the glaze and mixing that into the glaze. That thickness didn't make a lot of sense to me, because in reality, most of it's going to run off the pot and wind up in the catch basin anyway. So I began to spray the glaze on the piece, and I found that for me that worked quite well with the glazes I was using. If you watch the Li Hongwei video downstairs, you'll see that he pours the glaze over the piece. Okay, so then we go into the kiln with the assembly sitting in that shallow catch basin or on a waste plate. Part of the problem, another problem with working with these glazes, is finding a firing schedule that works with the glaze that you're using. This takes a lot of trial and error. So what's happening is the glaze melts while it's at a high temperature. The zinc oxide and silica combine to give zinc silicate, and this migrates and forms around seeds. Then on the schedule for the glaze I'm using on this piece, you go to a lower temperature and hold it for 2 hours. The zinc silicate precipitates and begins to grow the crystal. Then the temperature is increased to another hold temperature and held for another 2 hours. And you get the halo around that crystal growth. The crystal growth changes with the temperature change. So those crystals are actually an imperfection in the glass. And my understanding of this is that the glazes are a demonstration of what's called phase separation. The glaze melt separates into 2 or more liquids, and the colorants, metal oxides or carbonates, gather in one of those phases. So you see a difference in color between the crystal and the background. And here we've got the halo around the edge. Okay, so then I separate the piece. This actually, I forgot to take the picture. So this actually, usually you wouldn't see this line here. That would be just uniform glaze. So I set the piece back on it and faked it. But the next step here is to separate the pedestal from the piece, and I do that with a torch. What I'm doing is moving the piece on the banding wheel, heating that bottom pedestal and listening for a ping or a crack, indicating that glaze has split at that joint. So there's the piece that's been separated. It's broken glass at the base, so that has to be ground smooth. And I do that with a Dremel tool, with a grinding stone on it. Some potters will use a grinding wheel. Some will use a diamond disc, but I find for me that the Dremel works real well. So here we have the completed piece. So that's my process. And using that process, I make things in two general categories. One category is stuff or things, and sales of stuff and things keep the lights on and the studio doors open. So much what I do in that category is vases, lidded pieces, cups, mugs, bowls, that kind of stuff. This is a barrel form here, and it just becomes a surface to carve on. I don't put the crystalline glaze on the interior of a piece. Crystalline glazes have a high thermal expansion and can craze. I wouldn't consider them food safe. They're softer than the standard glazes that potters usually use that are suitable for food. So I use a liner glaze that is a standard glaze and not prone to crazing. Whoops. That's wrong. I don't know, something. Oh yeah, okay, I remember what I was gonna do. Okay, so we just got a series of works here. So here's a guy with the carving. This is a more sculptural form. It's a little bit hard to tell here, but this guy is flattened, and it's flattened and it spirals up. It's kind of hard to see looking at just one side of it. It's a little easier to see if it's turning. I call this a pistachio pot. This guy is birds over water. This is intended to represent a bird here. And then there's some carving down here. Looks like intended to look like waves. And there we've got a chickadee house. Okay, this I call a petal pot. The idea here is to represent the petals of a flower. I've come to be fascinated with flowers. The beauty, the detail, the functionality, kind of the mystery. In my head, I understand that plant germination and growth and flowering are the results of environmental interactions, genetics, chemistry. I get that. but in my heart, it just feels miraculous. And I'm amazed by it. It's also amazing to me that so many things in nature show Fibonacci numbers. Numbers of things from the Fibonacci sequence. You can see that in the numbers of flower petals. If you're not familiar with that, the Fibonacci sequence is each number in a series. You add the previous two numbers together. It goes zero, starting at 0, 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, 2 plus 3 is 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, and on and on and on. So anyway, I tend to use Fibonacci numbers in my work, like this pot has 5 petals. I do this for 2 reasons. Numbers, the Fibonacci numbers are represented in natural things all around us. They're common, well represented in nature. As I walk around the neighborhood with my wife looking at flowers, she's anxious to move on and I'm stopping there gazing. It's amazing how many 5-petal flowers you can find. The daisies in our backyard are 13 petals. Seeds in a sunflower represent the Fibonacci sequence. Petals in a rosebud, again, the Fibonacci sequence. And it turns out that the Fibonacci sequence is a very efficient way to pack things into a space. The other reason is it's just kind of fun to say Fibonacci. Fibonacci. Anyway, the other category of my work is my wonderings. Like I said, my work is influenced by the world around me, forms and shapes, including works of other potters, vines, birds, fish, flowers, also quotations and social circumstances. Things that strike me or make me think about something. I've got a bulletin board in the studio where I post quotations. This quotation is by Epictetus, a Greek philosopher. Every human situation is like a vase with 2 handles. If you have quarreled with your brother, you can pick up the relationship by the handle that is the fact that you have quarreled, or by the handle that he's your brother. I call this Epictetus 1, and what it's got is the high handle here of forgiveness and understanding, and the low handle of continued conflict. The handles come together on the body of the piece in the shape of a stylized heart. The heart is deeply divided, doesn't have too far to go before it would be broken. That kind of represents the importance of which handle you're going to pick this guy up by. The lid has this kind of wispy piece up here, and that's intended to represent the results of the decision being released into that relationship or being released into the world. This is Epictetus 2. Same idea on a different form. I've also made a number of what I call Epictetus vases. I call this piece Generations. It shows 3 different forms hanging one above the other. In my mind, they represent generations of a family or within a society. I suppose in an ideal world. Each generation a different shape, representing different experiences, but broadening as you go up. Going up represents older. And there's a thread. There's a thread running through these guys. 50-pound test fish line into this ball, which represents the ethos or the essence of that generation. As I was preparing this piece, if I remember right, I didn't go back and look it up. It struck me. This piece was in the West Michigan area show, I think in 2015. In 2014, my dad died. And I didn't connect that until I was doing this presentation. But I think there's a connection there. Sometimes things just kind of bubble up. You don't know they're there, and I've got to go back and check that and see if that lines up. Sometimes it's kind of fun too to give the clay its head and just sit at the wheel and do something with the clay without anything in mind. It tends to be very, very relaxing, kind of meditative. I call this piece, We Are More Alike Than Not. This piece shows 5 similar forms. These could represent 5 individuals, or 5 races, or 5 religions. Just as an aside, the Office of Management and Budget standards identify 5 minimum categories of race. There are also considered to be 5 major religions in the world: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. While the shapes are slightly different and the colors vary slightly, they go from dark at the base to lighter at the top. The space inside each one is pretty much the same. The composition or the materials of construction are the same. The glazed base is the same. The idea here is that the differences between them, while readily apparent, are actually pretty small. So we are more alike than not. Whoops. Okay. Yet there are these kind of discordant blue discs between each one. Keeps them apart. So it begs the question, how do you get around the separations? This piece I call separation. It shows a white calla lily representing new birth or new beginnings, and a white rose that can also represent new beginnings. The different flowers appear quite different, and yet they represent essentially the same thing. But here they're separated and facing away from each other across a wide divide. So that would suggest what might bring them together. This is one of the best explanations of empathy that I've found. Empathy at a deep level is the understanding that someone else's world is just as real as yours. One has to feel empathy to have compassion. One has to have compassion. I think I said that wrong. One has to feel sympathy to have compassion, and one has to have compassion to be empathetic. This I call empathy 1. Empathy 2 is in progress. So here, the stems of these flowers have begun on opposite sides of this piece. They've intertwined here in a common space, gaining understanding. And up on top, you have the blossoms leaning toward each other over the divide in an attempt to continue the understanding that they gained down here. So once again, I want to thank the KIA for this opportunity, and I'm most grateful for you all being here today. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Two questions. I think I'm getting this right now. The crystalline is shapes that look like ginkgo leaves. That's what happens with the chemical reaction.
Yes.
Okay, that's nice. And the other thing is the 5 bases on top.
It's about like that. Yeah.
Okay.
And it actually, those are 5 separate pieces, and they hang on a steel cable. Yeah. That also was in, I think that was West Michigan Area Show 2018, I think. Yeah. Yes.
Buy your glazes locally?
The question is, do I buy the glazes locally? No, I make my glazes. I think that you can, I think that there now are crystalline glazes that you can get commercially, but I've not used them. Oh yeah, everything, well, not everything. Most of the things that I do are thrown on the wheel. Yes?
Does, your process for making a glaze, does that mean you order, like say the zinc in maybe a liquid form or a powder form or something, and you mix it into another glaze? How do you make your crystalline glazes?
The question is how I make the crystalline glazes, and do I use the ingredients individually ordered from a supplier? And the answer is yes. Everything is ordered individually and then mixed together. Yes?
The handles look incredibly intricate. How difficult are those?
It takes some patience. The handles, those long handles like on the Epictetus, actually the handle form itself is done separately. And then I add a coil to make the connection from where I've connected the handle to the pot across the piece. So I mean, if I had to attempt to make that all in one piece, that handle, I guess, would probably be about this long. So I can't handle that. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for being here.